Good morning. My name is John Colonius, and I'm a senior pursuing a degree in international studies with a minor in business at the Kelley School of Business. I chose to be at Hamilton Luger because I've always been passionate about pursuing a career that engages with the evolving global landscape, particularly at the intersection of international systems, cultures, and economic exchange. During my time at HLS, I've had the privilege of serving in student government, initially as the inaugural funding board chair, and then as the treasurer. Through these positions, I've had the opportunity to help shape and grow student involvement on campus, contributing to a community that has given me so much more than I ever expected. It is truly an honor to be here with you all today at the 11th Annual America's Role in the World Conference. When I first arrived at HLS, I was simply a student trying to find my place, figuring out where my classes were, mapping how everything worked, and honestly just hoping I looked like I knew what I was doing. Over time, I discovered this path through the connections I made in student government, and I soon realized that this school offers much more than just an academic experience. It offers the chance to contribute something meaningful that can shape our campus, our country, and even the world. That's exactly the kind of community I hope to be a part of, and I'm genuinely grateful to be able to stand here today. Participating in student government has allowed me to be part of a process that has been instrumental in developing an organization still in its early stages. Through our collective determination and programs like ARW, the Hamilton Luger School is contributing to a stronger, more connected IU and global community, an impact supported by our partners, staff, and distinguished speakers joining us here today. Beyond campus, my experience including finance internships with multinational organization in New York with exposure to global operations, along with cultural immersion, international travel, and humanitarian mission work, have shaped my interest in global systems and cross-cultural engagement. As I look ahead to beginning my career, I've become increasingly aware of how interconnected our world is and how critical it is to understand the forces that influence global stability and cooperation. That is why conversations like the ones we have at ARW are so important. They challenge us to think beyond our immediate perspectives and engage with the complexities of global leadership. In particular, discussions about the role of the United States military's role in the world push us to consider issues of national and global security, diplomacy, and responsibility, topics that affect all of us, whether directly or indirectly. On a more personal note, I also had the opportunity to help bring one of today's speakers to this panel. It is a great honor to introduce to this forum an exemplary fellow Greek-American, General Andrew Pappas. His distinguished service, profound sacrifice, and unparalleled firsthand understanding of America's role in the world, from the front lines to the highest levels of military leadership, are truly remarkable. After speaking with him and hearing his perspective, I knew his insight would bring something truly exceptional and uniquely qualified to this discussion. I'm grateful that he could join us here today. Thank you, General Pappas. If there's one thing my time at HLS and ARW has reinforced, it's that engaging with diverse perspectives is essential to becoming thoughtful leaders in an increasingly complex world. Events like this remind us of the importance of dialogue, curiosity, and a willingness to learn from and respect one another. It is through leaders like those here today who embody these values that we are able to deepen our understanding. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our next panel on the United States military's role in the world, and our moderator, General Jean Renoir.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Am I working? Okay, good. Mom and Dad, he did good. Yeah. Well, first, welcome to everybody. It's a great treat to be back on campus at IU. I'm happy to say I'm an IU graduate, and although a few millennia ago. And I went on and served for nearly 40 years in the U.S. military, culminating with the command of the U.S. Northern Command and NORAD in Colorado Springs. But along the way, I had a chance to serve in D.C. General Pappas and I shared some common workspace over time. He is the J3 in the Joint Staff. That's the Director of Operations, and then the Director of the Joint Staff, who's like God in the Joint Staff. He moves all the chess pieces around and then tells the chairman and the secretary and others, here's how it's supposed to go. So it's great to be here with him today. Uh, Laura Cooper also is a friend, but we've crossed paths a couple of times in our career as well. She served both in State Department and in the Department of Defense. Did a lot of work in the Afghanistan era, but then got pulled into her real expertise, which is Ukraine and Russia and Eurasia. And she's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in that area, serving now at Georgetown, teaching a bunch of young, excited graduate students what the real world is like. I thought today it's important for us to go back a little bit in history to help put into context what the U.S. role of the military is in the world. We all us older people here, grew up in the era of the Great Cold War and the peer competition that we saw with Russia, primarily with Russia and the Soviet Union, and how that evaporated in the late 80s and early 90s, and we began to see a very different, diverse world, much more complex than I think leadership actually realized. In 2000, we had an election in the country, and President Bush was elected and came into office and it was inaugurated in 2001. He appointed a Secretary of Defense by the name of Don Rumsfeld, who had a very strong vision of transformation in the military. He believed that we were so heavy that we needed to change the way we thought about our military forces and how we would employ them and how we would engage them and how we would fund them. Unfortunately, his vision of transformation got altered just a bit because the world had a vote on September 11th, 2001. That was not the military Don Rumsfeld was trying to move to. It was a military that now had to take traditional skills that we had grown up and were trained towards and apply them to a shadowy enemy in a country that was landlocked by countries that we had no relationships with. That posed a very different problem, a landlocked problem and a challenge of logistic support to very small, lean combat forces. That vote of the world has continued over the last 25 years. And we see a military today that is approaching, again, peer competitors, certainly Russia, obviously China in a much more dangerous way, but also regional competitors that have kept us, I'll just say, very agile in how we respond to world events. Obviously, we saw the conflict in Gaza occur in the way that the Israelis dealt with that. We supported the Israelis as we struck Iranian targets in the 12-day war, and obviously we see today a very complex environment there. And it brings to question, so how does the military evolve to these world events? And I think it's important to understand that we have a series of strategic guidelines that are published for the Department of Defense to help us organize, train, and equip our forces. And we'll get to those in a minute. But we have a presidential strategic document, the National Security Strategy, that is taking a view of the world and how that administration wants to approach its dealings with our partners, our allies, our competitors, how it integrates the diplomatic and military and informational and economic elements of power. And it's important to understand that the military is but one element of national power. The National Defense Strategy translates that strategic view down from the White House to the Department of Defense. It's the Secretary's vision, and this new vision that we've just had published in 2026 has a bit of a different view than previous documents have had over the administrations of both President Bush, President Obama, President Biden, and now President Trump. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the third element on that food chain, if you will, and he develops and authors the National Military Strategy. And that's really the guidelines to the services on their organized, train, and equip missions. It also informs how they're funded and how they respond and what they'll be expected to do. And those are always great documents because all the programmers in the services are looking to go, okay, what's my budget going to look like? And then what do we do with that? Well, as some great Americans have said repeatedly, a plan is only as good as the first step in execution, and then the world votes. And we're seeing that in spades again today. So our hope with the panel today is to talk about the complexities of the world we are in, how we've been informed with the world that we've grown up through, and then where do we see that going forward. I suspect that the U.S. military in 2004, December, didn't expect that it would be steaming 4 carrier battle groups and a Marine amphibious group off the coast of Indonesia and Thailand to respond to a tsunami that devastated that region of the world. Oh, by the way, that response changed the political dynamic within Indonesia because the insurgents in the Banda Aceh region realized maybe we better negotiate with our government to create a better representative form of government. So across the times we've spent in service, we've seen the military asked to conduct operations that don't exactly fit into that job jar the way the national security strategy, defense strategy, and military strategy might have informed us. So we're going to delve into that today. We're going to save some time for questions, and I know I'm excited that we have a whole bunch of students in here today, and I think that's indicative of the quality of experience that you're having here at Hamilton Luger School and where you'd like to go and take this forward as you start your career. So, without further ado, you've heard about General Pappas, great Greek American. You know, I think we ought to just turn it over to Drew and let him lead this discussion. But Laura Cooper has also had a great depth of experience, as I mentioned, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. But that's just a snippet of her background. She's really done so much more, and we'll get into that as well. Let me start out, General Pappas, with you. We've talked about transformation a lot, and that's been a buzzword of a number of administrations. The Army's going through a significant transformation right now. In your role as the commander of U.S. Forces, or Army Forces Command, you were the implementer of that transformation strategy. Talk to us a little bit about how that's evolved and where the Army is today.
First, it's a great question. Thank you for being here, and thank you, John, for that gracious introduction. The transformation, if you look at the history of the military, and this is, I look at all branches, and I do want to say first off, Tim, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming up. Tim and I were in Afghanistan back in 11-12, then again 13-14, and fought a very difficult fight up in the Kunar River Valley. So thank you. It's great to see you again as he is leading our forces up there. But if you look at the Army and where we've been, I just, again, take a step back historically that you've identified. You've got evolutions and revolutions in the way we transform. A couple of those revolutionary times is World War II, introduction of the radio, to be able to synchronize the ability from both the sea-based, air, ground, and moving forward, you can see the development of these new capabilities and then to bring all the abilities to bring them together at the right time and place for the effects. That was a revolution in military adjustment. And we fought that way really up until the early 70s coming out of Vietnam. Then you saw coming out of the Arab-Israeli war, we saw another adjustment and introduction of new capabilities in our whole doctrine change, land-air, the air-land battle. And you saw the introduction of new capabilities that hadn't been here before. The M1 tank, the Bradley for the fighting vehicles, the new types of helicopters, attack helicopter, the Apache, and the Black Hawk. And then also, which you see today over in the Middle East, the Patriot missile, the denier defense. And then our doctrine changed and our structure changed. We're going through that again today as we've come out of this last 20 years plus a continuous conflict. Not the fight that we had anticipated going into September 11th, and we were there when Secretary Rumsfeld came in and we're starting to look at the adjustment. But it's the fight we had, a brigade-based, about 3,500, mountainous counterinsurgency fight. But it's changed. With the near-peer fights that we're having, the lessons that we've learned, and Laura and I were together when we were in the Pentagon when the Ukraine kicked off, and she led that effort, and we were in support of her as a joint staff, but the lessons that we've learned and where we see the future fight taking place. And so we talk about this transformation in contact. First, why is it in contact? Look around the world today. What we decided, and General George, who's the Chief of Staff of the Army, and the Secretary, we knew that we had to transform today. And the usual time horizons for transition is years. And you take a unit off, we have 58 brigades of that. You pull them offline, turn in the equipment, bring in new equipment, and train. We couldn't do that because the demands on the formation are such that you're continuously deploying. So that in contact portion is, we've got to move much quicker. And we can't take years, we can take a year. And we have to learn the lessons and bring new capabilities to bear. So the three-prong approach that we have in any transformation, going back to the other two, is first, it's not just about the equipment, though equipment's important. We're fighting a new domain, so our strategy and our doctrine has to change. We're fighting in space, we're fighting in cyber, which is critical. We have great panels on that today, along with our air, sea, and land. So we've got to develop new capabilities to bring to bear there, and then the way that we train those. So we're changing our doctrine. We also have to change our structure. When I was in Iraq, I had a cavalry squadron, a reconnaissance capability, human-based, going out deep. We were along the Iraq-Iran border. Well, today, because of the technology, we can do that with the drones and new other capabilities. So that formation doesn't even exist. We're changing our formations. We're building out new capabilities, space-based. We have a space force that's here today that didn't exist at the time. And cyber capabilities. So we've got to train that. So we're changing our structure, bringing all these new capabilities so that we can fight for the future, fight against near peer. And we're elevating from the brigade 3000 up to a divisional, because you got to synchronize across time and space. So you're elevating the formation that's fighting that. So you also then have to change how you train, how you fight. And you can see that. So as we take new capabilities, new structure, new training doctrine, and we accelerate that. And the only thing I'll tell you that's really different, that I was really excited about when I was at Forces Command, because we had, 750,000 people. It doesn't turn quickly, but we now worked in complement with industry. So as we brought new capabilities in, new drone capabilities, new infantry fighting vehicles, everything, new electronic warfare capability, counter-drone capability. Before, you had tested in a lab, you had a test unit, and then about a year or two later, as it passed through this training, you'd bring it to a unit. Because anything that you said is ruggedized or unbreakable, you give it to a soldier and they'll prove you wrong in about 5 minutes. But we're now bringing it, as it's coming off, as we now, in complementary with industry, we give it to the unit in a training formation. So as we hand it to them early on, and as we were working with the technology, we literally had coders forward with them. We had experts through the training rotation. So as issues came up, this doesn't work, we're having conflict in electronic warfare spectrums, it's negating our helicopters. They're fixing it there, and we continue to train. So you don't train, lesson learn, take it back over years. We're doing it at that point. And then that which works, we're adopting and spreading out to the formation. That which doesn't, we go back and say, look, appreciate your interest in national security, not working, come back again. Next element, bring it forward. So that's how we're doing transformation in contact, in real time, and accelerating, because you don't have time to do it over the historical approach.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're fixing the bike as we ride it, and unfortunately, there's people shooting at us while we're riding the bike.
That's right.
And that's a significant challenge. From my service perspective, from the Air Force, we've been evolving the technology of airframes, but also of the weapon systems we carry. And as we're seeing today, and we saw in both Afghanistan and Iraq, you have to be able to project that power over long distances, sometimes without any supply chain available to you, and then make it work on the other end. So it's a real significant challenge. And interestingly, I'm going to go to Laura here, because the Ukraine experience has been a learning experience for our United States military. We've watched a country who had certainly great human capability, good military capability, but innovate in a way that we never expected to see. And so, Laura, really talk about some of those things that the U.S. military needs to not only learn, but also then integrate into our own organized train and equip missions that you've experienced in Ukraine.
Absolutely, and again, it's great to be here. I can't wait to hear from all of the terrific students here at Indiana University, and I think this will be a good conversation. When it comes to what we've learned from Ukraine, I think it's very important to put that in the present tense or the future tense, what we will learn, because I think we're really just at the tip of the iceberg. And I would start not with technology, because that is important, but really with the human factor. And I think you have to remember, as we entered the war that Russia thrust upon Ukraine in February of 2022, the U.S. government, the national security establishment, the US military was still really reeling from a very painful withdrawal from Afghanistan, where our assumptions about what might happen with our longstanding partners that we had worked with for a couple of decades really were shattered. And there was a lot of discussion about our failure to understand will to fight. Well, that same issue came into play in kind of very senior level and really popular predictions about what might happen in Ukraine, because there wasn't this understanding of the will of the Ukrainian armed forces to fight, their ability to innovate, and also the importance of the whole of society approach in supporting those Ukrainian fighters. I mean, you look at the Ukrainian society, just this last winter, Russia was pummeling their critical infrastructure, and you had millions of Ukrainians without power, without heat, with temperatures at kind of 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. This is a society that is strong and that is resilient. But we don't really have a military planning tool that can measure that. That's not something that we typically understand. And Americans like our wars swift and technology driven. So that's just my first point. My second point relates to the technology, and it actually dovetails really beautifully with General Pappas's point about how the U.S. Army is trying to transform. What you see on the Ukrainian battlefield today with unmanned systems, with drones, whether they're in the air or in the sea, is this incredibly fast cycle of innovation. And it's a bottom-up cycle. So General Pappas described how we're trying to adjust a little bit to have more feedback from kind of the lower echelons about whether equipment is working. In Ukraine, they're creating it from the bottom up. They're actually creating the capabilities, and they have direct liaison at the unit level. So you could have a squad level liaison with industry. Industry has people forward, and they are creating new drones all the time. Russia is a bit behind, so Russia tends to be about 3 months, sometimes as much as 6 months behind in copying what Ukraine does. Russia then does have a lot of capacity to push it out at scale and start to produce at scale, whereas the Ukrainians are a bit smaller. And that's where the next kind of innovation moment, I think, comes into play, which is that in supporting Ukrainian defense industry, Western industry, Western militaries can not just make Ukraine more effective and give them some of that scale manufacturing capacity that they just don't have inside of their war-torn country. We can also learn from it, and we can learn in real time. And this is where, for all the good work that we're doing in the US military, I think some of our NATO allies actually have us beat on this. I've seen so many deals struck in the past 6 months to a year where you have European drone companies backed by their governments with resources, investing in Ukrainian drone companies, and then partnering, and then that learning happens organically. So I think we can knock the Europeans all you want about past lack of investment in defense spending. I would not provide that criticism today. I mean, since the end of the war, since the end of the Biden administration, the Allies' investment in Ukraine has been greater than ours. We were number 14 as a percentage of GDP in our investment in Ukraine in 2024, 2025. So the Europeans are investing, but they're investing smartly with these industrial partnerships that are win-win solutions.
That's great, thank you. And I think the challenge for the U.S. is we're seeing maybe a gap growing between the U.S. and its European partners, our NATO allies, because they see they've got to learn from these experiences and they've got to invest. The good news is, having spent 14 or 15 years in NATO, they're investing at levels we've never seen them invest before. And that's very welcome. To assume that they can carry their own weight against a peer competitor like Russia may be a bit of a stretch quite yet. And so we need to preserve those relationships that we've had for sure.
I do think it's important, though, and Laura hit on it. We've learned a lot of those same lessons, a lot of the acquisitions that have constrained our ability to purchase. we're now overcoming. And the Secretary of the Army has pushed that. He came from industry, and our partnership with industry is working that also, because we have to move at the right speed, the way that we purchase things, the ability to adjust those. An example I'll give, in 1998, some of you are like, when is that? But it was the Shadow, it was a UAV capability. And in 2006 in Iraq, it was great. In 2011 in Afghanistan, it wasn't. In 2018, I was back in Afghanistan again, we still had the Shadow. And we're still purchasing it because it was a purchase of hardware over a long term and a very strong congressional contingent. We couldn't kill it till a year ago. And as Laura pointed out, they're developing within weeks new capabilities at the forefront of the fight. And we're carrying something that's over 2 decades old, and we couldn't break the contract. We have. But we have learned those same lessons, and then also by being nested and working with a lot of our larger corporations and elements that are out there. We brought 5 CTOs in as Army reservists, that the CTOs from Meta AI, from Palantir. This is bringing that intellectual capability into the military so we can grow with them. And I'll tell you, a decade ago, I went with the chairman out to a trip out to Silicon Valley and spoke with some of these same companies, because we were trying to work on new night vision devices and get them incorporated into the military development, and they didn't want to do that. Some of them were hesitant to be a part and aligned with the military, which I found interesting because they're still selling face recognition software to the Chinese, but it was distasteful, again, my own friction. But now, they're a part of our capability. They've put the uniform on. They're bringing that intellectual capacity so that we can move at the right speed with an intellectual base. We talked about large language models, and one of the individuals there says, why are you spending money on that as a military? We put $20 billion a year into it. You can't match us. Let us do this. So those partnerships we've learned from that. And again, with Laura here, it's great because she was at the forefront driving that through our own interagency capability and across the country.
That's a great segue. The explosion, really, of technology across the battlefield and in space is truly revolutionizing the way we employ our military, but also it's bringing technology that we didn't grow up with. So we have to learn as decision makers, how do we adopt the right procedures to implement that and bring it into our forces. Back to your experience at Forces Command, were you seeing effort by strategic thinkers to recreate doctrine that allows us to accept AI and hypersonic weapons that move faster than we can almost react in many cases, and certainly autonomous systems that you've mentioned? How are we thinking through that integration of capability?
And you hit the right term, doctrine, how we fight. And the doctrinal base, and obviously you adjust to the environment that you're in, but it's a baseline for going forward. We rewrote our own doctrine. Again, identifying coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq and those fights and looking at near-peer fight of the future. We had to change how we fought and elevate it up. And again, I go back to what domains are we operating in? Space and cyber being new. So we better have a way in which to fight and synchronize and integrate that to all else that we have. And the introduction of these new weapons, hypersonics, long-range precision weapons, everything, the ubiquitous space. In space today, you can't hide anywhere. Our headquarters in Afghanistan, even Iraq, there were little Taj Mahals, and we had a gym in them, because we didn't have the threat that's there. Today, you can't have that. Any vehicle that's moving, and we see that, even off commercial satellite imagery that we use out of the training center in California, where we have a brigade that's about 3,000 people, 100 and some tanks. Anything that moves is seen. You cannot hide. So how do you camouflage and hide in plain sight? And how do you negate that? And every time you push your radio, you're putting off an electromagnetic signal that's targetable. So how do you mask that? That changes the way in which we fight, which is the doctrinal approach. And then once you have your doctrine set, then you identify the needs and the technology-based, some that exists, some that is still, I'd say, aspirational, but we know what we have to get to, and apply it to the fight for the future. But we're working that. I mean, we talked about these changes that we had both on UAVs that are coming forward. That's the new mass for the fight of the future, and that ubiquitous fight that we have. Precision long-range capabilities. The new tank that's coming on board, because the survivability of the tank that's got to be integrated, electronic warfare capabilities, negating counter. And we turned a tank that was supposed to be 5 years in the making, and they did it in 1 year, because we had to accelerate it so we can get it into the force and train with it. And the first prototype's coming off the line this year. I mean, you go back to World War II, and you talk the foundry of freedom, and we're starting to see that today. Not at scale, but in terms of development of the technology that can be integrated into the fight. So again, you got to change your doctrine, because the fight's changed. You got to bring new technology, and then our structure is also changing in order to meet that.
One of the important aspects is the human element in all of this, and you've got to retrain, if you will, that operator to operate at the speed of the systems that he's or she is attached to. In the Air Force, we've adopted a number of AI tools to help within the cockpit, so that a pilot in the cockpit has a helmet-mounted cueing system, a head-up display that brings all of the information of his external sensors right in front of his eyes. And now we're at the level where it can begin to inform the pilot of, what do you do next? This is not good. Think of this. And that's accelerating the reaction of the individual aviator in a way that makes them more survivable. The human piece of this is always there, and there's some concern about AI taking away jobs of civilian jobs, but there will be an art form in the way we integrate AI into our military that preserves that human force that we must have. As we're seeing today around the world, you can bomb the heck out of many things, but ultimately you have to have somebody on the ground to influence decisions. And that's really important for us as we find our way forward. I want to go back to Laura for just a second and talk maybe a little bit more about our friends in Europe, how they're seeing world events today. You talked about they're changing the way they invest in their own defense, but are we seeing a recognition that we also have a significant foe in the Indo-Pacific region, and how are they thinking about China as a potential competitor, both militarily as well as economically?
Well, thank you for this. I think that, going back many years, Europe has had its primary focus from the threat perspective on Russia, and their wake-up call was Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They didn't quite get the message in 2014, nor did we, but 2022 really was the moment when they started revving up their defense industry. I was surprised to see that Rheinmetall, which is the German manufacturer, actually is probably going to exceed US 155 ammunition production starting next year. So they took it seriously. I think from a bilateral basis, US and any European country, there's a tremendous amount of concern that the United States doesn't understand the degree to which they've invested and the degree to which they've changed that trajectory, which was, a downward trajectory of defense spending for many years. And they also took on board the China threat before the war in Ukraine. They certainly looked at, economic threats from China. They took very seriously threats to their telecommunication systems that would have undermined NATO information security. And you even had NATO allies working with us to do joint patrols in the Pacific, something that one would have never really imagined. Now, with the war in Ukraine and the fact that the US has entirely pulled out, I mean, in that national defense strategy that was just issued, it basically said, we're just going to hand everything off to Europe. It burden shifted rather than burden shared. So the Europeans are really tightly pressed to be able to support Ukraine and invest in their own defense. And then they look to China, and I mean, that's in some cases a bridge too far. I think they also feel like they have to hedge. And sadly, for me as an American, it's very sad that they feel like they have to hedge against U.S. support, because they look to the future. They look at the fight over Greenland and these accusations that are really baseless about their lack of investment. And they feel like they probably can't count on the US like they used to. So when they see that picture, it feels like a very scary world to them if they both have, China as a potential threat and lack of US support. So you see them hedging a bit right now.
That brings up a great point, and I'm sure that there are many in the Foreign Service who wouldn't necessarily place the military in the diplomatic world. But there's an element of diplomacy that the military has enjoyed as long as we've been around, and that's in the personal relationships that we've established with countries across the globe. We've got some Indiana Guardsmen here today, which is great. They have a great international partnership. The Guard has a great program of partnering with nations around the world to maintain those relationships. We have international officers coming to our senior service schools at the mid-grade and senior grade levels. Those relationships that they form there last forever. And I mentioned Indonesia a while back. The reason we were able to put those forces in so quickly is that the current, at that time it was the PACOM commander, now the Indo-PACOM commander, had gone to senior service school with the individual who was the chief of defense staff in Indonesia. He didn't go through the normal chain to get to them. He picked up the phone and said, "Hey, it's me. I can put this on your front doorstep tomorrow." And literally they created an agreement that bypassed a lot of the traditional processes that one might have to go through in order to get emergency assistance on the ground. We did a similar thing in Haiti when the earthquake occurred. That was not my area of responsibility as the commander of NORAD and U.S. Northern Command, but Southern Command, who owns that part of the world, didn't have the resources. So I gave them an air command and control capability. I gave them airlift. I moved forces to his headquarters so that they could provide for the command and control of those relief forces. So the military operates in many non-traditional fashions around the world, and I think that that's going to be more important as we go forward. We're talking about the future role of the U.S. military in the world, and there's a relationship piece of this that I think we'd be mistaken if we let that fall aside and we discontinued some of those relationships. Drew, talk about sort of your experiences with our international partners and how we've engaged with them.
Well, it's an imperative issue that we have to address, especially today in the environment that we have. But if you look at even the topic here, the role of the U.S. military, in the world today, really three key things that we expect of us. First, there's deterrence, and then there's the assurance with our allies, and then, if called upon, to fight and win our nation's wars, and do so decisively. But that deterrence piece, the greatest victory is when you never have to fight. And that becomes having a credible capability, and it comes from the depth of our alliances, because you can impose such a cost on the enemy that it changes their decision-making in order that they're not going to attack you. Those alliances right now are under duress, as Laura identified. It's still there, but it's caused some cracks. And I had the opportunity as a young officer to do a year as an exchange officer with the Greek army. You talk about a good gig, yeah. So as a young man living in Greece. But those same bonds are today. I mean, in 2 weeks I'm going back to their school to speak. But that's throughout the entire world. Those relationships, we bring them here to the school, we build relationships, they understand it. The bonds are there. When the attack into Ukraine took place, the California Guard had that partnership, and the California Adjutant General, the two-star, was best friends with the Ukrainian leader, and that was literally our best communication. So that the chairman, we had him on the phone. He says, "Oh, I just spoke with General so-and-so, and here's what's taking place." That was our intel flow. Why? Because there's a depth of trust. The partnerships that we had, we saw those in Afghanistan. We saw them in Iraq. The alliance, and that was under the ISAF flag, so they were there. The Poles, out of Chicago, there was a partnership with Poland. And the Polish formation that was there was partnered with a U.S. Guard unit out of Chicago. But these bonds were there that you can pick up the phone. There's trust built. You train together. Shared visions. And that has been the strength that we've had. And again, back to the deterrence piece and the assurance piece. when America says we're standing with you, we're part of this alliance, whether it's NATO or a lot of the ones we have throughout the Indo-Pacific and other places, there's a trust that's built in that, and that can't be shaken. And that's imperative that we keep that. Because if they don't have that trust, I'll use the Middle East as an example, if they don't have an assurance of that alliance we're going to be there, you're going to see a propagation of capabilities, because if they don't believe that they're under our capability, they're going to have an arms race, because they're going to have to compete because they don't have our support. And you're going to start seeing that, and that's a destabilizing effect in any region it takes place. That's our role. It's one I think we should embrace. It's one we have since the end of World War II and the world order that there is. And it's one that we have to continue on, because it is meant for peace.
You know, I've mentioned this a couple times, those elements of national power, there's not a dividing line among them, the diplomatic and the information and the economic and the military. They're a collaborative partnership there. And all of us, no matter what part of government you're in, share in some of that. And maybe one of the best ways, one of the best examples that I saw in my career was in Afghanistan, when we were clearly made progress, maybe even more rapidly than some thought. We realized that you had to establish some sense of support to the Afghan leadership in the towns and communities around the country. And so we established regional support teams, PRTs, so-called PRTs, Provisional Reconstruction Teams, that were established across Afghanistan, and they had elements of military and State Department and justice and agriculture all pulled together to help advise those regional leaders on how to recreate a functional society in their area. And in many cases, the leaders of those teams were not necessarily a lawyer or a doctor. They were a National Guardsman who happened to be a lawyer and a doctor, who had that leadership skill, but also that practical skill in the civilian community. So the total force that is the military is something that's also very critical to us. And you know, that has, I know our Guardsmen and Reserve friends would say that's had its ups and downs over time, but they become a critical element, because you can now draw on, from the first panel, a soybean and corn farmer from Indiana who happens to also be a Guardsman, to come and help you establish a new and beneficial agricultural area in a part of Afghanistan. That's what the military brings in terms of its breadth of capability. And I think that so-called soft power is something that we need to continue and be very aggressive with going forward. I know Laura saw some of that PRT work and that soft power work, but talk to us a little bit about how defense looks at that element of soft power in its day-to-day operations.
You inadvertently touched on a moment of early pride in my career. As a very young action officer, I authored the policy on PRTs.
There you go.
That said, I was always...
Then she gave it to me to implement.
There we go. But I was very disappointed in our inability to fully resource them with the full panoply of civilian capabilities. But you know, in today's world, I actually think it's the information kind of pillar where we need the most collaboration across what we call the interagency, and where we're really on our back foot. We are perennially on our back foot. Since we are here at the Hamilton Lugar School, I just have to mention, you know, in my recent career, we were suffering from vicious Russian propaganda and also Chinese propaganda that was directed at our biomedical research cooperation programs, many of which stemmed from the non-Lugar programs to prevent proliferation of WMD from the former Soviet Union. In fact, there was this one center in the state of Georgia, the country of Georgia, that was called the Lugar Center, and Russia was propagating all of these lies, again picked up by the Chinese, about how we were producing bioweapons in this location. These were DoD-funded centers, and the U.S. military had a really strong stake in ensuring that we could do medical and health-related cooperation with other countries, because we figured the first victim of the next pandemic is highly likely to be a member of the U.S. military, expeditionarily deployed. So these cooperative programs were very important, but DoD didn't have the tools to be able to respond to all of this disinformation. We had to reach out at the time. There was Voice of America, there was Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, there was the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, and frankly, I still think we were kind of inadequate in responding. I think those messages, including during COVID-19, the message that the US was the origin of this virus, that was a message we were seeing from Beijing and from Moscow. That message got sent all around the world, and the message that US vaccines were no good, that got sent all around the world to include inside the US. Again, propagated by Russia and China. But back then, at least we had tools to work with. You know, I had counterparts I could talk to across the interagency, and we could try to work together. Today, sadly, many of those tools have been dismantled, and so we're in even worse shape institutionally than we were back then, but the voices in Beijing and the voices in Moscow and in Tehran, for that matter, are very, very loud.
Yep.
Gene, if I could, one of the things to this discussion, if you elevate it, one of the first principles that bases that question is the military alone is not an independent actor. It is but one lever that we have for national power. And it's all meant to support our policy end states. But they have to work in unison, they have to be synchronized across if we're going to be effective. I think we're seeing that today in the Middle East. And you've got to have all these capabilities if you're going to meet a political end state, not just the military being utilized. And that's highlighted by what you just identified. And if we don't have the mechanisms to synchronize that, then it's often, you're going to have a substandard and a suboptimal solution.
We share a great friend who was my planning lead right after 9/11 at U.S. Central Command when I was the director of operations, a guy named Dave Halverson. He would ask me 8 times a day, boss, what's the end state? That's a really tough question, and it's one we may not be asking ourselves today very well. In order to plan a military operation, you kind of need to know where you're going to get to. What are you trying to achieve? What's that end state? And without that, you can break a lot of things, but you don't necessarily achieve the objective that you had going out. And so I think it's important. My wife asked me that, by the way, also once. So on the night we began operations in Iraq after Afghanistan, we had a video teleconference with the president. He was approving our planned operations. And he gave the go-ahead to commence early the next morning. The president and the Secretary of Defense and all of the civilian leaders left the video teleconference, and there were 12 2-, 3-, and 4-star generals left and admirals left on the video conference. 9 of us were sending our children into harm's way that night. So my wife routinely says, make sure you take care of my baby. Know what the end state is, because I want him to come home. Now, she said some other things about getting rid of me, but make sure you take care of my baby. And that underlines the fact that this defense, this military, is also a family affair. Many of our kids and friends and relatives are serving. And we want to make sure that we don't put them into harm's way without a good end state in play and a means to get there. Okay, we have hit our 30-minute question mark, actually pretty well. We have 30 more seconds.
Beautifully timed, beautifully timed.
So why don't we do this? Let's open up to questions, and then we'll have a quick closing comment going around. So we got microphones, lots of questions. There's a gentleman back here on the right. Do we have a mic? And then we'll come back over here on the left. Let's go down here he had his hand up first. We got to go to the very first eager beaver.
Hello, thank you so much for the great talk. My name is Mohammed. I'm an international student in second language studies, and I'm from Iran. So, I wanted to ask you something about, you talked about the trajectory that U.S. military has, made throughout the years. But I wanted to ask you about how you would evaluate U.S. military operation and performance in the recent war. Because on the one hand, we have Israelis who had a lot of rapid targeting. They were able to take out many IRGC leaders, as well as the supreme leader of Iran, and a lot of intelligence-driven operation. But on the other hand, we have the US, which suffered from loss of a lot of jets, some men, unfortunately, and I think, yeah, that's basically it. But for the record, I wanted to say that I am against the Islamic regime, and I believe that any religious state in general, and an Islamic one in particular, is a nightmare for any nation. So anyways, I wanted to know how you would evaluate U.S. military operation. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think there's a couple issues, and we'll probably all three of us have a thought or two here. First, you have to understand that two very different forces. The Israelis have a very capable Air Force and had very specific objectives in their operations. We had a much broader set of objectives and set of targets with a much larger force, and so we put significantly more aircraft and people in harm's way. That's the nature of coalition warfare. It was that way in Afghanistan and in Iraq, a couple times in Iraq. So it's understandable that with that large a number of folks in harm's way that you may have more risk. I think that the one aspect of this that has been maybe surprising to some in the U.S. has been the non-conventional way that the Iranians have continued to strike targets, and I think that yes, we lost an aircraft. Fortunately, we got both of those crews out with some heroic effort on the part of many. But that's part of the business that we plan for, and that's what makes the U.S. military so relied upon, because it does have those capabilities. And so I think I would, if you looked at just statistics, I would say the military performance has been exceptional, highly professional. There's always going to be an error that occurs. Humans make errors at times, and the enemy always gets a vote. They always have something up their sleeve that you will have to react to, and I think we're seeing that the case.
So I would just say, from a kind of a defense policy perspective, this mission has been a failure because the end state has not been clear, and it has not been clearly articulated to the American people or to any potential international allies or partners. We have actually been really successful in all of our previous wars in my lifetime in building coalitions and working together with allies. And that, reduces costs to the US taxpayer, it reduces risk for the US taxpayer, and I mean, they're force multipliers in ways that are hard to explain, including sometimes with their cultural knowledge and savvy in the particular region that the United States might lack. We didn't do any of those things in the case of this military operation. So it places the U.S. military in a very difficult position, and the U.S. military is always exceptional, always rises to the occasion. Always performs with this professionalism, but from a civilian policy perspective, which is my background, this is not the way to run a war.
Okay, let's keep rolling. We have a question over here.
Oh yeah, I do want to highlight on the military side, but your key piece, we're talking two different things. Again, you didn't see the integration of all the instruments of power.
Yeah.
This is a military campaign, and with the Iranians, they're looking at they've made it a political solution, economic. So you've got a mismatch in approaches. But just to the military piece, and I'll talk about two of them, and I'm not a cheerleader for it, but really the context. I would disagree that it's been a failure. Look at what took place, and with Venezuela, again, whether you agree with it or not, or going into Iran. That is a sovereign nation that has advanced capabilities, air defense capability, integrated air defense, a depth of a Navy, a depth of an Air Force, and a large ground force. and they were destroyed. You've gone in, you have freedom of movement to the skies. Again, you're not going to take care of every capability. As we've war gamed this before, when you were there,
Yeah.
capital ships were at risk that were going to be in that area. Aircraft were going to be brought down. Human loss is much higher. The capabilities that we are bringing to bear in a nation, every other country is going to look at because we penetrated what was an impenetrable area and dominated that space. So on the military side, it's a success. They generate over 480 sorties in a day, unheard of. Part of that is with AI capability to integrate, because just think of the synchronization, get that many aircraft in the air, deconflict the airspace, deconflict the electromagnetic spectrum so you can operate there and penetrate these areas to negate it between two countries, and they each had different objectives. It really is, as horrific as war is, it is pretty impressive what they're able to accomplish militarily.
Yeah.
And I'd say the same thing going into Venezuela. Agree or disagree, sovereign area, advanced capabilities to negate it, a ground element. We were able to penetrate that space, put an element on the ground of highly trained operators, capture bureau, and come back out. Helicopter took some damage. Again, agree or disagree, any other country in the world, and a lot of them had Russian and Chinese capabilities to defend them, and they were all penetrated and were found ineffective, they're going back and looking at their own war plans.
Yeah, just to note, the Iranians were equipped with frontline Russian air defense systems,
Yeah.
and they are rubble now, so. Yeah.
And just to be clear, I agree that the U.S. military was completely successful in accomplishing the mission that they were given. I'm questioning this from a larger policy and then strategic implications for, this is, the U.S. role in the world, strategic implications for the U.S. role in the world.
Fully agree.
Okay, we have a question over here, and then we'll come back to the two ladies in the back, and we have one over here.
Hi, Ryan McDonald, a second-year MA student here at HLS. I wanted to thank you all, and my question was sort of something that Professor Cooper, I think you had also started to circle around, of the transformation of the military's role has also been, in large part, a function of the executive also using it for a lot more than previously. How much of this transformation in the military is also a function of domestic arrangements between the executive and the legislator? And if we want to have the Congress essentially take a larger role, what are the changes necessary to happen in government to understand what an effective military is like?
You got it.
So I think there's a lot packed into that question. The U.S. Congress has always had a voice in foreign policy and in resourcing, in particular, for the U.S. military, and that will remain. In terms of the decision to, employ U.S. force, that has always been something that we've looked to the commander-in-chief. And if you look at the War Powers Resolution, there is supposed to be this element of consultation with the U.S. Congress, though we have not seen that in, again, kind of in my lifetime, in my memory. I think it's really, really important that even if the executive firmly believes they have the votes and firmly believes that they can, deploy U.S. forces wherever it is in the world for whatever kind of major operation, that they go through those consultations, because the Congress is representative of the American people. And if we don't have the support for our military operations from the American people, you will start to see an effect on American support for the military in general. And this is not a path that we want to go on.
In the back? Young lady standing up there.
Hello, everyone. My name's Celine Yang, and thank you again for being here today. Earlier, Professor Cooper, you mentioned the current tensions with and towards China. So my question is, with China's increase in military pressure around Taiwan and the balance of power shifting, what is the U.S. military actual role in the crisis, deterring conflict, preparing to fight and win, or shaping the conditions so war never starts?
Wow, I would actually say all of the above. So, I think right now what we face is a challenge of our deterrence messaging. When we first looked at our policy as we saw Russia preparing for its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we sketched out a policy that at the time we believed would not just support Ukraine's sovereignty, but would also send a message to authoritarian regimes around the world that you can't change borders by force without consequence. So the measures to impose costs on Russia were both to get Russia to back down, but also as a message. And initially, we thought that Beijing was listening. China provides a lot of support to Russia, but most of it is kind of under the table. And they're not very vocal about the resources that they are supporting Russia with. And we thought that was in part because they actually feared some kind of a huge, sanctions regime, punishment if they were to go ahead and invade with Taiwan. Honestly, in the past year, I am not sure if that calculus holds because of how, Beijing might be interpreting our, pulling all of our, financial support for Ukraine out. Kind of the public treatment of Ukrainian leaders by U.S. leaders, I'm just not sure if that deterrence message is even still there.
Yeah. And the underpinning of that goes back, the Treaty of Westphalia, that you can't change borders through aggressive action. And that's why it was imperative at the time, it was under the Biden administration with the Ukraine, that we came forward with that, to send that message that still holds the case. I'm not sure. Now, we don't have a declarative policy on Taiwan that we're going to defend it, so it's still ambiguous. But as you talk, what is Taiwan doing at this time? They're making themselves a defensible island. They call it the porcupine, and their defense spending is going up. They're having a lot of consultations of what that looks like in order to defend against a cross-channel attack, which is a very difficult operational maneuver to execute. And internally, a lot's turning to Taiwan, and a lot turns back to, as we spoke of, the Afghan will to fight versus the Ukrainian will to fight. To the people of Taiwan have that same will to fight. Because if they don't, it doesn't matter what you pour into that, they'll fail.
We had one lady in the back, she had her question, and then we'll come back down in front here, trying to get as many of the student questions as we can as well.
Thank you so much for this discussion. My name is Tatiana Gabrichuk. I'm the last Russian Fulbright Scholar at Indiana University, I guess. And my question to you is regarding their U.S. military approach of defending the energy system, because with the development of the artificial intelligence, and specifically with the development of the small nuclear reactors, there is still a problem of how to actually defend that, considering their cybersecurity threats, or considering the way how the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant unfortunately got seized by Russians, and the workers there are actually being held hostage for the years. So are there any lessons the U.S. military is learning and maybe already scaling, if that could be shared? Thank you.
I'd go to Lord Hicks, but it's interesting you said the military defending that for the domestic, because that's actually by our own structure. It doesn't fall under the Department of Defense. It falls underneath the Department of Homeland Security. And that's the challenge, because then you have cybercom and other capabilities that may come in later, and that was a big discussion. So you look, because we've got a lot of capability and capacity, DOD, but they don't have lead for that, so you're nesting underneath another agency. And that's where some of the friction comes out.
Yeah.
Sir, you
You were in charge of this, yeah.
Thanks for that question. General Pappas is right. That's not a principal U.S. military role. However, the commander of U.S. Northern Command in Colorado Springs has a role for the defense of civil authorities, defense support to civil authorities, and part of that becomes key and critical infrastructure. Now, we have to get into how you define each particular part of our civilian infrastructure, but certainly power, communications, energy are critical to not only the military's role, but our day-to-day civilian life. And so we partnered in my headquarters in Colorado Springs. I had 52 departments of government that lived in my headquarters, to include the Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, and many others. And we had a collaborative working group that met once a week to look at critical infrastructure protection plans around the country. And our role was not to fix them, but we had an important role to take advantage of capabilities that existed. I mentioned the National Guard earlier and our reservists earlier. There's a real resource within the National Guard in particular that understands power plants. And so they can help advise, because they're working in that every day in their real day jobs. And so we were able to put together an action plan that said, here are the steps we should be taking to ensure protection. Now, every time you take a step, some adversary takes a second step, and you've got to react and respond to that. So it's not a perfect system by a long shot. Ultimately, I'll call it the force protection responsibility, if you will, resides with the Department of Homeland Security, and we can provide military support to that upon request and approval by the Secretary of Defense. So it's an active and serious issue that we face every day, in fact, the military is one of the leading experts right now in that small or micro nuclear power plant capability. We're putting 2 of those into our Air Force bases to test out not only how they produce, but also how vulnerable they are and how do we protect them. So I think there's a lot of work being done. Department of Energy has got a significant role there. So will we see a blackout? We may see one. But we've also seen it because a tree falls on a power line and takes out 10,000 homes from electricity. It's not, there's nothing perfect there. Now, okay, yes, ma'am. You.
Yeah.
Quick, we got a microphone coming. If you hand across.
My name is Natalia Shulga. I am actually from Ukraine. And I want to praise all of you for mentioning it's not conflict, it's not it's real war going on. So let's be clear about that. And my question to all of you is that in this situation today, when U.S. pulled out from being helpful or present or even a partner in some way, what do you think Ukraine can do more to influence or restore our long-term partnership through the years? Because Russia will not disappear or not will go to the clouds. This is our enemy for over 300 years, so we know about Russia more than any university in the world. You just use our knowledge and expertise in all fields. And particularly now, I'm so proud that American military is surprised what can be done for much less money. And I praise Professor Cooper for acknowledging it. So my question, what should we do more to reestablish our partnership? Thank you.
Well, I work with Ukrainians all the time, and they're the best partners that we could have, I think, in many, many respects. I don't have any kind of silver bullet solution for restoring ties, but I will say that I think that the American people actually, if you look at polling data, have tremendous support for Ukraine. And if you look at the data about how the American people feel about Russia, the last time I checked, it was only 9% of Americans actually think that Russia could be a partner. Everyone else either thinks that Russia is an adversary, enemy is actually the word in the poll, or a competitor. So there's a strong foundation of support in the United States, and I think that's important to maintain. I think that's kind of keeping your eye on the long term. The other piece, and I think everything that the government of Ukraine is doing to shore up ties with European allies, to shore up ties with Middle East partners, I think all of this is tremendously useful and important. I think we do have to start to look to what does that post-war horizon look like, and that's where you could imagine a lot of opportunities for commercial partnerships with the United States, security partnerships, and a really constructive role for Ukraine to play in European security. Not everybody sees that, but I think there's a really strong case that can be made literally to the American people.
Okay, we got time for 1 or 6 more questions.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the gentleman, young man in the back, she's got a microphone.
I feel like
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. Respect.
Let me just say, let me do this. Ask your question, and then we'll take 2 other questions before, and then we'll try to capture the answers all together.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your service, respectively. I'm an HLS student, International Law and Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures double major, and I was going to ask about the recent attack by an Iranian FPV drone on the Iraqi Black Hawk, our military base in Iraq on a Black Hawk. It took one of ours out. What is the U.S. military's current direction regarding protection against these FPV drones that have done so much damage against Ukrainian forces and now one of our own Black Hawks? Thank you.
Okay, we'll hold that. And then down here, yep.
Hello, my name is Sadhu McLeod. I'm a first-year student here. Thank you all for your service and for this discussion. At the beginning of the discussion, General Pappas, you referenced the transitioning military environment and how there's more resources that are required for successful deterrence and victory in conflict. I was wondering how the U.S. can engage with their partners to increase the production and development of these new and important mechanisms, particularly like in technology and artificial intelligence, especially as some of these alliances that have been established and working for a long time are now being criticized.
Good. I think that'll pair well with the other question. Yes, ma'am?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Haley Ward, USMA class of 25, current grad student at SPIA. And my question is, are you concerned with the military's ability to compete infrastructurally at the level where the military may rely on the civilian home front for mass production as we saw in World War II? And if so, what do you think that we need to do to prepare for the next LISCO in that sector?
Wow. Okay. You want to jump on the first?
Yeah, I'll certainly jump in on that one. But it's a great question. You saw with the FPV capabilities that have come forward. And I'll go back to some of the lessons learned we've seen out of the Ukraine and how we've drawn a lot of that capacity and capability. And without a doubt, we have turned to industry to identify capabilities to negate that. We're looking at microwave capabilities. We're also looking at capabilities that are laser produced to pick them up, but you have to identify them. In the electromagnetic spectrum, ability in the EW element to negate their ability to fly, while still, so you can stop them from coming from one area, but allowing by frequency manipulation, you can still move in that area. So this layered and integrated approach to that. Additionally, you've seen some that have acoustic capability that are integrated with radar. So once you identify it, then you can bring up this whole bevy of capabilities, again, microwave, laser, counter-drone drones that'll take off and take out those drones. So it is always layered and integrated, our ability to get after those capabilities. A lot we've pulled from our lessons learned out of the Ukraine and other ports that are taking place. Now, does one get through? Proven it's been able to do that, especially a FPV that may have, that's tethered off of a capability that then you can't pick up its signals. But that is your best defense in order to do that, layered and integrated, and then to negate the capability forward. And the question that you brought forward, are we partnering with industry in order to bring that forward and also with our partners? Absolutely. And I take it back to the best in breed. What have we seen coming out of the Ukraine? What have our European partners that have brought forward? What have we seen in the Indo-Pacific? And if it is a capability that is out there, that is the best that's out there, we will bring it forward. I find it interesting with some of the drones that are there, some of the American drone companies, go back to the cheaper, it's very tough to compete because some that are made in the Middle East and out of Europe are exponentially cheaper. So we're purchasing those. Now they have American parts because you don't want to have a fault built into the capability itself. But we are going across the entire spectrum, getting the best that's out there, and then finding that migrating it back here. First we test it, and then we utilize it. And I would agree, Freedom's Foundry is a great book if you look at World War II and our ability to scale up as we've done. But we also weren't under duress in our capability to manufacture in the United States during World War II. They didn't have the ability to reach us. You had internal sabotage, but not external. We have the ability to do that in the United States, manufacturing-wise. We can turn it at a time. Now it's a little delayed. We're trying to build our industrial base a little bit more, trying to spread it out from not only the large ones, but small capabilities. You're seeing the investment by private equity to do that. You've seen the government and DOD itself, and Chief Randy George was beating that drum. We've got to increase it today, especially our ability to manufacture the weapons capability, these exquisite weapons that come 10 off a line. We have seen it's not your magazine capacity before the war, but your ability to replace it because of the expenditure rates. So we're going back to industry now to expand that out. Now, anybody that's got any industry base says, hey, that's great, pay us first.
Yeah.
You know, show us a 10-year outline on production before we build a new factory or a new production line. And that's where we're at. But everybody is looking at that. Industry's tied into that, and we're moving to that direction. We're well ahead in the procurement of capabilities. We're a little behind in our ability to build the industrial base where it needs to be, but they're moving that direction.
You know, we haven't talked about it.
Congratulations to class of 25. It's awesome.
We haven't talked about our Navy friends very much here, but clearly shipbuilding is a major concern of this current CNO, and clearly the Commander-in-Chief has made a number of comments about shipbuilding. And when you look at other models around the world, Koreans in particular, they're producing 5 to 7 times the number of ships we do in a year. We've got to harness that capability. A large Korean-owned but U.S.-led company called Hanwha just bought the Philadelphia shipyard. Mike Coulter, who we used to know in OSD, is their president of defense operations, and his objective in the next 5 years is to triple the output and to add a submarine line to that shipyard. That significantly enhances our ability to accelerate, because even if we wanted to build another ship today and had a check in our hand, it would take 7 to 8 years before that would even get off the blocks and into the water. We can't afford to be that slow. And so I think the good news is industry is seeing that as an opportunity, and they're beginning to put some thought and money behind that to help develop that capability for us going forward. Yeah. All right, we have about 2 minutes left. This gentleman was tried 2 or 3 times, and I've been quiet down here, but let's do that, and then we'll wrap up for today's session. I know lunch is next, right? Yeah.
Hello.
Okay.
Samuel Obeng. I'm a linguist by training. My question hinges on the intersection between language, politics, and the military. About 2,000 years ago, a person posed this question to another friend: we don't know where we are going, how can we get there? That echoes the point you made about knowing where you're going and how to get there. Then also, I want to emphasize the importance of the Peace Corps in diplomacy. For me, it's one of the most important American foreign policy. I am what I am now because I was taught by American Peace Corps volunteers some 40-something, 50 years ago. Now, my question hinges on diplomacy and religion. And the question is, given the, the appropriation and textualization of religion by political actors, and I prefer to call them actors because, the world, our world, has been turned into a theater of chaos, with these actors inserting themselves onto the scene, and some causing more chaos than others. The question is, how and to what extent does the appropriation of religion impact your work, your professionalism, if it does at all? And then the other question is, during the Ebola crisis in Liberia, the U.S. military was the first to pitch tent, and there was considerable respect for the U.S. military in that area. So my suggestion is, to do both. Be the professionals that you are, but then also, do some diplomacy, because that works. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, and we are running out of time, but very quickly. So my son, youngest son, who's a physician now, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal right after 9/11, and so he was in the far eastern Muslim part of the country. He was not allowed to tell anyone what his father was doing because I was forward in Afghanistan. But I think maybe to try to capture a little bit of that, and then maybe give Laura and Drew a chance to finish up. Diplomacy is part of what we in the military do every day. Your example when the Ebola crisis occurred is a perfect example. But we've done that hundreds of times around the world. We don't do that as truly a diplomat. We do that as a military who's trained with the skill sets to help. And I think that's a core element of who we are as the United States military. Let me run down the line.
I would just make the statement that, I think that US military, diplomats, development workers can all present US values as a strength of our country and as something that is a positive extension of US partnership without it entering into religion at all.
Drew?
I'm in agreement.
Well, thank you all for being a great audience and great questions. We really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
And you're off to Greece.